When the Trump administration launched a wave of aggressive tariffs, few felt the tremors more than Canada. Suddenly, the country's economic lifeline to the U.S., its largest trading partner, looked dangerously fragile. Auto parts, steel, aluminum, even maple syrup faced steep duties. Businesses scrambled, supply chains choked, and Ottawa knew one thing: survival meant diversifying fast. But here's the twist. While America turned inward, other nations opened their doors. Quietly, strategically, countries stepped up to fill the gap. Some offered new markets for Canadian exports. Others ramped up imports, forged investment deals, or brokered tech partnerships. This isn't just about tariffs. It's about how Canada rewired its global position in the face of economic shock. These countries became more than trade partners. They became buffers against collapse. Number 10. Japan. Japan may be halfway across the Pacific, but in the wake of U.S. tariffs, it became one of Canada's most crucial allies. When American trade barriers began squeezing Canadian exports, Tokyo fast-tracked agreements to deepen economic ties. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, provided the framework. But crisis gave it urgency. Between 2020 and 2024, Canadian agri-food exports to Japan grew by 31%, according to Statistics Canada. Maple syrup, wheat, and beef that once flowed south to U.S. kitchens were now showing up in Tokyo's high-end supermarkets. Japan's appetite for premium Canadian produce kept farmers employed and supply chains moving. With the U.S. rattling global alliances, Japan also leaned into diplomatic solidarity. Defense dialogues, ministerial summits, and people-to-people exchanges between the two nations all surged. Japan wasn't just a buyer, it became a partner in resilience. And perhaps most importantly, Japan brought predictability. In a time when U.S. trade was volatile and political, Japan's steady hand gave Canadian businesses the confidence to invest and expand. The result? A relationship that quietly reshaped Canada's Pacific strategy and showed how old allies can become new lifelines. Let's keep going. The next country strengthened Canada's industrial backbone at a time when it needed it most. Number 9. Germany. When Canada's U.S.-bound auto parts and machinery exports got slapped with sudden tariffs, Germany stepped in as a major alternative. Already one of Europe's industrial powerhouses, Germany had the infrastructure and appetite to absorb high-quality Canadian components. This wasn't a new relationship. It was one that scaled up fast under pressure. According to Statistics Canada, Canadian machinery exports to Germany rose 27% between 2020 and 2024. The two countries expanded their industrial cooperation through new logistics and supply chain agreements, especially for precision tools and aerospace parts. For Canadian manufacturers shut out of U.S. markets, Berlin became the new gateway. Germany's demand for Canadian minerals, especially cobalt and rare earths, also surged. With Europe seeking to reduce dependence on China, Canada's clean mining reputation played a strategic advantage. Germany's automakers were particularly interested in Canadian battery inputs as they ramped up electric vehicle production. Canadian energy tech companies, especially those working in renewables, also found new clients in Germany's aggressive green transition. From wind turbines to hydrogen infrastructure, the bilateral collaboration deepened beyond trade into joint innovation. The result? A resilient economic corridor between two like-minded democracies. Germany didn't just buy Canadian goods. It opened doors into the entire EU market. Number 8. Mexico. At first glance, Mexico might seem an odd savior for Canada during a trade war, but geography and shared trade frameworks made it a key fallback. As part of the USMCA, Canada and Mexico already had harmonized standards and customs procedures, which made redirection of trade smoother than many expected. When U.S. tariffs made northbound exports risky, Canadian companies rerouted supply chains south. According to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, exports to Mexico rose 21% from 2020 to 2024. From canola oil to pharmaceuticals, Mexican demand for Canadian products quietly grew. More critically, Mexico helped preserve trilateral supply chains, especially in the auto industry. Canadian auto parts bypassed the U.S. by shipping to Mexico for final assembly. This protected Canadian manufacturing jobs while dodging the worst of the tariff hikes. Mexico also opened opportunities for Canadian service providers, including engineering firms and financial consultants. The cultural compatibility and ease of doing business helped Canada deepen its Latin American footprint through this partnership. This collaboration wasn't always in the headlines, but it was felt on factory floors and in freight lanes across North America. Mexico proved that old NAFTA ties could still deliver in new geopolitical storms. And the next country on this list? It turned Canada's agricultural exports into global bestsellers. Number 7. India. When the U.S. imposed tariffs that rattled global trade flows, India became a surprisingly agile ally for Canada. The two nations accelerated economic dialogues, deepening ties through the Canada-India Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement (CEPA) negotiations. While a full deal remains in progress, the urgency of the moment pushed both sides to prioritize trade facilitation and fast-track sectors like tech, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture. According to Global Affairs Canada, trade with India surged over 20% from 2021 to 2024, driven by Canadian pulses, lentils, and lumber exports. With U.S. markets narrowing, Indian demand helped offset what Canadian farmers and forestry workers lost across the border. These weren't just new customers, they were stable, growing ones. India's massive pharmaceutical industry also opened doors for Canadian biotech and healthcare firms. Joint ventures and clinical trial collaborations spiked, with Canadian innovation pairing with Indian scale. The result? Affordable, high-volume production with a Canadian edge. On the energy front, India invested in Canadian liquefied natural gas (LNG) terminals, seeking long-term energy security amid global disruptions. This positioned Canada as a reliable supplier while attracting billions in foreign investment to its resource sector. India's youthful demographics, tech boom, and hunger for sustainable infrastructure made it a perfect match for Canadian expertise. While Canada had long looked to the West, this moment proved that turning east could be just as rewarding. Let's move on. The next country rebuilt Canada's manufacturing momentum after the U.S. slammed the brakes. Number 6. South Korea. When U.S. tariffs disrupted North American industrial supply chains, South Korea quietly emerged as Canada's manufacturing lifeline. The Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement (CKFTA) became a critical tool, allowing goods to flow freely as trade routes rerouted around American barriers. Between 2020 and 2024, bilateral trade in machinery and electronics rose nearly 25%, according to Statistics Canada. Canadian companies that once sourced parts from the U.S. began forming supply deals with South Korean firms instead, especially in automotive components, semiconductors, and industrial equipment. But it wasn't just parts. It was investment. South Korean giants like Hyundai and LG invested in Canadian battery plants and green technology hubs. These moves helped preserve Canadian jobs while advancing clean energy goals, making South Korea a partner in both resilience and reinvention. Korean buyers also stepped up imports of Canadian seafood, beef, and canola, helping balance agricultural trade flows hurt by U.S. market contractions. And culturally, the two nations leaned into education exchanges and joint research in AI and quantum computing. South Korea's geopolitical reliability and high-tech capabilities made it a strategic friend in a moment of disruption. It didn't just patch gaps, it helped Canada leap forward. Number 5. United Arab Emirates. You probably didn't expect a Gulf nation to play a key role in Canada's economic survival, but the UAE stepped up. In 2025, Canadian exports to the UAE hit $2.3 billion CAD, driven by high-tech equipment, agri-food, and renewable energy components. And it wasn't just trade, it was timing. After Trump's tariffs hit Canadian aluminum and steel, the UAE boosted its purchases from Canada's metals sector, especially for construction and aviation. According to Global Affairs Canada, the UAE became a top non-Western buyer of Canadian aerospace parts and machinery. This gave Canadian exporters a new lifeline when U.S. orders plummeted. But trade was only part of the story. UAE-based investment funds poured capital into Canadian cleantech and real estate, offsetting capital flight caused by U.S. uncertainty. Projects in Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary benefited directly. And let's not forget about logistics. With U.S. ports tightening, UAE carriers expanded freight routes to Canadian hubs, making global exports easier. Dubai-based DP World even invested in Vancouver's port expansion. In a moment when traditional partners backed away, the UAE leaned in. And Canada was better for it. Up next, a country halfway across the globe stepped in to fuel Canada's export engine during a time of tariff chaos. Number 4. Vietnam. Vietnam, often overlooked in North American trade strategy, became a powerful pivot point for Canada when U.S. tariffs threatened global trade certainty. As a fellow CPTPP member, Vietnam already had the framework to enable rapid trade scaling with Canada. Between 2021 and 2024, Canadian exports to Vietnam surged by 36%, with wood, seafood, and wheat making up key shipments. In return, Vietnam increased its shipments of electronics, textiles, and machinery, helping Canadian retailers fill gaps left by U.S. supply contractions. The Vietnamese government also actively welcomed Canadian companies seeking new manufacturing bases outside China. Several Canadian apparel and tech firms opened factories in Ho Chi Minh City, supported by favorable tax agreements under CPTPP. Vietnam's rising middle class proved an unexpected win for Canadian agri-food exporters. Sales of Canadian wine, beef, and dairy soared, thanks in part to joint marketing campaigns and lowered import duties. Education and energy also saw gains, as Vietnamese students chose Canadian universities in record numbers, and energy firms explored green technology investments in the region. For Canada, Vietnam wasn't just a supplier, it was a full-spectrum partner in growth. And the next country on the list? It helped stabilize Canada's financial backbone when others turned inward. Number 3. Indonesia. While many focused on China and Europe, Canada was quietly forging new ground in Southeast Asia, and Indonesia led the charge. In 2025, Canadian exports to Indonesia reached $1.9 billion KD, marking a 17% increase year over year. Indonesia's vast middle class, now over 135 million strong, created massive demand for Canadian wheat, seafood, and pharmaceuticals. When U.S. buyers pulled back due to tariffs and currency instability, Indonesia opened its markets wider. Even more crucial was Indonesia's pivot toward clean energy and critical minerals. Canada's mining firms stepped in to supply nickel and cobalt, two essentials for Indonesia's booming battery industry. According to Canada's Ministry of Natural Resources, exports of raw nickel to Indonesia more than doubled in 2025. Trade agreements also moved fast. Canada signed a bilateral investment framework with Jakarta that reduced red tape and opened access to public infrastructure projects. While others debated policy, Indonesia bought Canadian goods, invested in its mines, and helped diversify trade beyond the U.S. Canada didn't just find a buyer, it found a partner in growth. Number 2. France. When U.S. tariffs threatened Canada's aerospace and wine sectors, France became more than just a trading partner. It became a lifeline. In 2025, France expanded its import quotas on Canadian aircraft parts, maple products, and specialty grains. This policy shift followed a major bilateral trade mission held in Montreal, where both sides pledged to deepen cooperation. According to Statistics Canada, exports to France increased by 18% in 2025, with Quebec leading the charge. French firms also invested over $3.1 billion KD into Canadian manufacturing, offsetting major losses caused by declining U.S. investments. In particular, Bombardier's new joint venture with Airbus France has kept thousands of Canadian aerospace jobs alive. France's political support for Canada during international trade summits further bolstered confidence in the partnership. As U.S. tariffs isolated Canada from North American markets, France championed Canadian access to EU programs and infrastructure funding. This diplomatic backing proved essential in keeping Canadian exports moving. One key development was France's endorsement of a fast-track lane for Canadian agricultural goods through the EU customs system. This allowed Canadian producers to bypass much of the red tape typically faced by non-EU members. As a result, Canadian goods began arriving in European markets faster than ever. With cultural ties deepened through education exchange programs and shared climate goals, the Canada-France relationship evolved beyond trade. France's timely intervention in 2025 didn't just help Canada survive the Trump tariff era, it helped it adapt, modernize, and thrive in new global arenas. France didn't just buy Canadian goods, it helped Canada prove to the world that economic strength doesn't depend solely on U.S. partnerships. In a shifting global order, this partnership is proof that strong allies can still build stronger futures. Number 1. China. When Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies shook the foundation of North American trade, it was China that quietly became Canada's economic parachute. Despite growing global tensions, Canada's exports to China surged to $36.4 billion KD in 2025, a 14% increase from the previous year. From energy and timber to seafood and technology, China helped fill the void left by declining U.S. imports. One of the most critical areas was Canada's agricultural sector. With the U.S. market destabilized by tariffs, China began importing more Canadian canola, barley, and lobster than ever before. According to Statistics Canada, canola exports alone rose by 22%, helping prairie provinces avoid economic collapse. These purchases provided desperately needed liquidity for farmers struggling under U.S. trade uncertainty. In the tech space, China partnered with Canadian universities and innovation hubs, fostering joint research in AI, clean tech, and quantum computing. While critics have raised national security concerns, the immediate result has been a surge in funding and job creation across Canada's innovation sector. Whether you view it as a partnership of necessity or a new global alignment, China's role in cushioning Canada's economy cannot be ignored. In a world where alliances are shifting fast, this relationship proved that survival sometimes means turning toward former competitors. When Trump's tariffs hit, many feared Canada's economy would spiral, but instead of collapsing, Canada adapted by turning to allies old and new. From France and South Korea to China and Vietnam, the global map was redrawn, and new partnerships filled the gaps left by America's retreat. These 10 countries didn't just trade with Canada, they helped rebuild it. They offered markets, investments, and lifelines when Canada needed them most. In the process, they've reshaped how Canada thinks about its economic future. The lesson here? No nation is an island, especially in times of crisis. As U.S. policies grow more unpredictable, Canada's diversified alliances may prove to be its greatest strength. So, if you want to understand where the world is heading next, keep your eyes on the nations building bridges while others build walls. Hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who still thinks America's the only game in town. We're just getting started. See you in the next one.